The sound was a death rattle. A deep, guttural, metallic cough echoed through the cavernous, sterile white of the Dynacorp Innovations laboratory. The sound of a multi-million-dollar dream dying was the only thing that could silence the room's most powerful voice. Dr. Aris Thorne, CO, stood with her arms crossed, a slash of crimson power sewed against the blinding white. Her expression was a mask of polished titanium, cold, impenetrable, and utterly unforgiving. She had built an empire on the ruthless efficiency of her mind, and this noise was an unacceptable flaw in her universe. The cluster of engineers in lab coats around the engine housing took a collective, unconscious step back, as if the failure were a contagious disease they might catch. Again, Aris commanded, her voice a whip crack in the tense air. His senior engineer, a man named Higgins with a sheen of sweat on his brow, flinched. "Ma'am, the harmonic resonance is tearing the housing apart. If we push it again without—" "I did not ask for a diagnosis, Higgins. I asked for a demonstration, again." With a trembling hand, Higgins nodded to a technician. The ignition sequence word. For a moment, the engine, a masterpiece of polished titanium and coiled carbon fiber named Project Icarus, purred with the promise of limitless power. Then the cough returned, deeper this time, a shuddering thump-thump bang that shook the entire test rig. A warning light on the central console flashed a violent, accusatory red. Aris closed her eyes, a single, slow blink of profound disappointment. When they opened, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Get it out of my sight," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "And get someone in here who can actually fix it. Not theorists, a mechanic." That was the cue. The double doors at the far end of the lab hissed open, and Elijah Jones walked in. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that seemed entirely out of place. Assistants didn't escort him. He carried his own toolbox, a heavy, worn, and scuffed reinforced polymer case that had seen more miles than most cars in the Dynacorp parking garage. He wore clean but faded navy blue coveralls with the name Elijah stitched in white script over his heart. His thick-soled and steel-toed boots made no sound on the polished concrete floor. He was a study in contrast to the room's clinical perfection. Where everything was white, he was a splash of grounded, practical color. He was a portrait of calm focus, while the engineers were animated with panic. His eyes, a warm and intelligent brown, immediately found the ailing engine, bypassing the powerful CEO and her terrified team as if they were scenery. Higgins seized the opportunity to deflect. Here he is now. The specialist from the automotive division. Aris's gaze swept over Elijah from his work boots to his close-cropped hair. The dismissal in her eyes was instantaneous and absolute. It was a look he knew well, a quick assessment that filed him away under help and not human. "This is the specialist?" she said, her tone dripping with acid. "The one we pulled from tuning company sedans? You interrupted a $40 million project for this?" Elijah didn't flinch. He set his toolbox down with a soft thud. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that held no trace of subservience, only professional calm. "I was told there was a problem with a resonant frequency issue on a high-output turbine." His use of the correct terminology gave her a moment's pause, but it was quickly buried under her mounting fury. "The problem," she said, strolling toward him, her red-soled Louboutins clicking like a countdown to execution, "is that I have a board meeting in 4 hours. A meeting where I was supposed to demonstrate an engine that will revolutionize urban air mobility. Instead, I have a costly, very broken paperweight." She stopped a few feet away, looking him up and down again. "And you?" Elijah met her gaze evenly. "If I could take a look." "A look?" She cut him off, a humorless smile on her lips. She turned to her audience of engineers, playing to the gallery. "He wants to take a look. Tell me, Mr. Automotive Specialist, did you get your degree from MIT? Or was it more of a vocational certification?" A few of the engineers offered weak, nervous chuckles. Higgins stared at his shoes. Elijah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The engine doesn't care where I learn, ma'am. It only cares if I'm right." Aris let out a short, sharp laugh. "Confidence, I admire that. Misplaced, but admirable." The pressure was getting to her. The investors, the board, and her towering reputation were all crumbling to the sound of that metallic cough. She needed an outlet, a victim, and the man in the coveralls was a perfect target. She began to circle him, a shark scenting blood in the water. Let's make this interesting. You see, I believe in incentives. I believe in stakes. Her voice took on a theatrical, mocking quality. So here's my offer. You fix this engine. You make it run smoothly, quietly, and at 110% of spec. You do the impossible. She stopped in front of him again, leaning in slightly, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper for everyone to hear. And I'll marry you. The silence that followed was absolute. It was more shocking than the engine's failure. It was so profoundly arrogant, so dripping with condescension, that it stole the air from the room. It wasn't an offer. It was the ultimate insult. A statement that his success was so unimaginable that she could offer the most absurd reward conceivable and still be safe. Elijah stood perfectly still. The humiliation was a physical heat on his skin. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, some pitying, most amused. He saw the flicker of cruel victory in Aris Thorne's eyes. She had put him in his place. She had turned his professional skill into a pathetic joke. But deep within him, a cold fire ignited beneath the layers of composure. It was a fire stoked by a lifetime of being underestimated, looked past, and having his intelligence and capability dismissed at a glance. He thought of the sacrifices, the late nights in his garage at home, the dog-eared textbooks on aerospace engineering he read after his shift, the quiet pride he took in a job done right. He looked past Aris, past the smirking engineers, to the engine itself. His eyes traced the lines of the fuel injection system and the turbine housing mounting. His mind, a brilliant engine in its own right, began to work, cross-referencing the sound he'd heard with schematics he'd studied for fun. He finally spoke, his voice quiet but cutting through the silence like a laser. The pre-ignition sequence is out of phase, he said, his eyes still on the machine. You're using a direct spark ignition, but your fuel injectors are firing on a delayed cycle, based on a software patch meant for a smaller chamber. The fuel is pooling. When the spark finally hits, it's not igniting a mist, it's detonating a puddle. That's your resonance. That's your bang. The smirk vanished from Aris's face. Higgins' head snapped up, his eyes wide. It was a diagnosis they hadn't reached in 2 days. Elijah turned his gaze back to Aris. He held it for a long, tense second, letting the accuracy of his assessment hang in the air between them. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not respect, but surprise, and the faintest shadow of doubt. He picked up his toolbox. You don't have the right diagnostic software here. Your systems are too new. My shop has the tools I need. Aris recovered, her arrogance rushing back to fill the space of her brief uncertainty. Running away so soon? The wedding's off. Elijah walked toward the engine, stopping just beside her. The scent of her expensive citrus and bergamot perfume clashed with the smell of oil and hot metal. No, he said, his voice low and firm. I'm not running. I'm going to fix your engine. He turned to face her fully, and for the first time he allowed a steely edge into his tone. And you, Dr. Thorne, are going to call your board meeting. Tell them to be here in 4 hours. Tell them you have a demonstration ready. Aris's eyes widened. His audacity was breathtaking. And as for your proposal, Elijah continued, a world of dignity contained in his words. When I'm done, you're going to apologize. To me and to every person in this room whose expertise you just mocked. He didn't wait for a response. He turned to Higgins. I'll need the full schematics. And I'll need your team to help me decouple the primary housing from the test rig. We're taking this to my bay. He didn't ask. He instructed. And after a stunned moment, Higgins found himself nodding. Why, yes. Right away. Aris Thorne was left alone, seething in the middle of her lab, her outrageous bet called, and the unbelievable reality dawning that the man she had just tried to destroy might actually be her only salvation. The game was on. The stakes could not be higher. And the clock had just started ticking. The journey from the pristine, air-conditioned sterility of the R&D lab to the automotive service bay was a descent into a different world, a world of gritty, tangible reality. Elijah led the procession, his worn toolbox swinging with a steady rhythm that matched his pace. Behind him, Higgins and 2 junior engineers guided a heavy-duty electric cart carrying the million-pound heart of Project Icarus, shrouded now in a protective static-free tarp. The whine of the cart's motor was a funeral dirge for their pride. They moved through corridors that grew progressively less glamorous. The abstract art and polished chrome gave way to safety posters and industrial lighting. The air changed, losing its filtered, scentless quality and gaining the familiar, honest aroma of high-octane fuel, warm rubber, and cutting oil's sharp, clean scent. To the Dynacorp executives upstairs, this was the basement. To Elijah, it was a sanctuary. Bay 7 was his domain. It was immaculate, but not in the showroom sense. It was the orderliness of supreme function. Tools hung on shadowed boards, each outline filled perfectly. Diagnostic computers, their casings yellowed with age, but their software was meticulously updated and hummed on rolling stations. A half-dissected electric sports car sat on a lift in the corner, its innards exposed like a patient in surgery, waiting for its mechanic to return. "Over here," Elijah said, his voice cutting through the bay's ambient hum. He pointed to a heavy-duty workbench cleared of all but a protective mat. Gently, the engineers maneuvered the engine onto the bench with the reverence of pallbearers. As they stepped back, they looked lost, their lab coats glaringly white against the utilitarian gray of the bay. They were theorists, coders, and designers of virtual systems. This, the physical, greasy truth of the machine, was alien territory. Higgins wiped his brow. "Mr. Jones, we truly appreciate your help. Dr. Thorne, she's under an immense amount of pressure from the board, the investors." Elijah was already unclipping the latches on his toolbox. The sound was a sharp, decisive snap-snap. "Pressure isn't an excuse for poor leadership," he said, without looking up. His tone wasn't accusatory. It was a simple statement of fact, and it shamed Higgins into silence. Elijah lifted the lid of his toolbox. It wasn't just a collection of wrenches. It was a library of solutions. Precision torque wrenches sat next to custom-ground screwdriver bits. A digital oscilloscope was nestled beside a vintage analog multimeter which his father had given him. This was the arsenal of a man who spoke to machines in a language they understood. "The schematics," Elijah said, holding out a hand. Higgins hurriedly handed over a tablet. Elijah plugged it into his primary diagnostic computer. Lines of code, 3D models, and fluid dynamic simulations flashed across the larger screen. His eyes, which had seemed so calm and out of place upstairs, now blazed with focused intensity, scanning the data at a speed that made the engineers exchange startled glances. He was in his element, and they were just spectators. As Elijah began the meticulous process of connecting sensor leads to the engine's primary bus, the doors to the bay hissed open again. Aris Thorne stood there, a silhouette of power against the brighter light of the hallway. She had come to see the spectacle, to confirm her own superiority. She walked in, her heels clicking on the oil-resistant floor, a sound that seemed absurdly out of place. "Progress report," she stated, as if addressing a subcommittee. Elijah didn't turn around. His hands were inside the engine housing, feeling for the vibration sensor. The initial diagnosis was correct. "Your software is trying to compensate for a hardware flaw. It's putting a bandage on a broken bone." Aris's lips tightened. "My engineers designed that software. And they're very good at writing code," Elijah said, pulling his hands out and wiping them on a clean rag. He turned to face her. "But code can't overcome physics. The injector nozzles you're using are designed for a linear flow. Your combustion chamber, with its new geometry, creates a vortex. The fuel gets caught in the swirl, condenses on the cooler chamber walls, and drips. You're not getting a clean burn, but a series of micro-explosions." He pointed to the scrolling data on his screen, a chaotic waveform spiking violently. "There's your harmonic resonance. It's not a design flaw in the engine. It's a design flaw in the part you put in the engine." The junior engineers stared, their mouths agape. Higgins looked like he'd been struck. It was so obvious, yet they'd been so focused on the software and grand design that they'd missed the simple, physical truth. Aris's composure cracked for a microsecond. The possibility that this man, this mechanic, had found in minutes what her million-dollar team had missed for days directly threatened her worldview. Her arrogance, her one defense against the looming failure, reasserted itself with a vengeance. An interesting theory, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. And I suppose you have the correct, magical injector nozzles just lying around in your toolbox? No, Elijah said calmly. I don't. A satisfied smirk started to form on her face. I'm going to make them, he finished. The smirk died. Make them? This is precision aerospace engineering, not a pottery class. You can't just whittle a solution out of a block of metal. The material is a titanium platinum alloy grade 5 to 7, Elijah said, walking over to a locked cabinet. He punched a code into a keypad. The lock disengaged with a solid thunk. Your specs call for a tolerance of within 2 microns. My lathe is calibrated to within 0.5. He opened the cabinet to reveal a small, state-of-the-art CNC machining lathe, a tool of breathtaking precision that looked utterly incongruous in the service bay. Higgins gasped. That's a German military-grade micro lathe. How did you? I built it, Elijah said, as if he'd built a bookcase, from spare parts and some modifications. Dynacorp throws away better components than most companies ever get to use. He selected a blank cylinder of the specialized alloy from Iraq, his fingers judging its weight and balance with an artisan's touch. Aris watched, a storm brewing behind her eyes. This was not going according to plan. His competence was a mirror, forcing her to see her own desperation. She needed to reassert control. This is absurd, she declared, her voice rising. This is a $40 million project. You're not going to hand machine a critical component on a cobbled-together tool in a service bay. I am calling the board right now to postpone. She pulled out her phone, a sleek black slate of glass and ambition. Elijah stopped. He placed the alloy blank carefully on the lathe's bed. He turned, and for the first time, he let her see the full force of his will. It wasn't angry, it was resolute, absolute. You made a bet, Dr. Thorne, he said, his voice low but filling the entire bay. You bet your pride against my skill. You bet that I was beneath you. You don't get to fold now because you're afraid the hand might be mine. He took a step toward her. You wanted a show for your board? You'll get one, but it's on my terms, in my house. He gestured to the engine. This isn't your project right now, it's my patient. And you're in my operating room. You can either be quiet or you can get out. The audacity of it left her speechless. Her phone hung limply in her hand. In her entire adult life, no one had ever spoken to her like that. Higgins and the other engineers held their breath, waiting for the explosion. It didn't come. In the quiet authority he commanded in this space, something in his unwavering certainty disarmed her. She was a queen who had wandered into the territory of a different kind of king. Slowly, she lowered her phone. She didn't apologize. She didn't concede. She stepped back, leaning against a tool cabinet, her arms crossed, a spectator in her own company's downfall, or resurrection. The tension didn't leave the room. It simply changed form. It was no longer about whether Elijah would succeed. It was about watching a master at work and a CEO forced to watch. Elijah turned back to his lathe. He slipped on a pair of magnifying loupes. He took a deep, centering breath, and the world around him seemed to disappear. Only the machine, the metal, and the mind were guiding his hands. The high-pitched whir of the lathe starting up was the sound of the Underdog beginning his work. The first shower of brilliant, golden sparks that flew from the alloy was the opening act of a silent, breathtaking drama. And Aris Thorne could not look away from her place against the wall. The micro-lathe whirred, a sound like a hummingbird's wings amplified 1,000 times, a high-precision song of creation. Elijah's hands moved with a preternatural steadiness under the intense, focused beam of an articulated work light. The loupes magnified his eyes, making them seem vast, unblinking pools of concentration. He was no longer just a mechanic. He was a sculptor, a neurosurgeon of metal. Aris Thorne watched, her earlier fury banked into a smoldering, incredulous tension. She had expected frantic action, the clanging of tools, the sweat of desperation. Instead, she was witnessing a profound, almost meditative, calm performance. Each movement was economical, purposeful. The shavings of titanium platinum alloy curled away from the cutting bit were not scrap. They were golden wisps, proof of material being transformed by will. Higgins found his voice, a hushed whisper meant for the other engineers. He's not just replicating the design. Look at the intake aperture. He's altering the internal geometry. He's adding a helical groove to induce a counterspin to the fuel mist. That's brilliant, one of the juniors briefed. It would use the vortex instead of fighting it. It would create a more complete burn. Aris heard them. Their shift from terror to awe was a silent indictment of her leadership. She had fostered an environment of such fear that her brilliant team had been too scared to question a fundamental component choice. They had tried to solve the problem with lines of code, afraid to suggest the solution might require getting their hands dirty. Elijah's world had shrunk to the point of a diamond-tipped cutter and the shimmering metal beneath it. The bay, the watching executives, and the humiliating bet all faded into a distant haze. This was where he was truly alive. This culminated in 1,000 late nights, burned fingers, and failed experiments disguised as lessons. He heard the engine's cough not as a sound, but as a mathematical error, a flaw in an equation he was now rewriting by hand. He thought of his grandfather's garage in Alabama, the smell of old gasoline and red clay. The man had taught him that tools were an extension of the mind, that respect for the machine was respect for oneself. He thought of the scholarships he'd turned down, choosing instead to work and care for his sick mother, studying engineering from library books by the dim light of her hospital room. His PhD wasn't from MIT, it was from the University of Adversity, and his diploma was the callous skin on his hands and the flawless parts he could create from raw metal. Snap, click, whir. He swapped tools with a magician's deftness, moving from the lathe to a sonic calibrator, checking the harmonic frequency of the newly machined part. The readout glowed a steady, satisfied green. Perfect. Without a word, he carried the new injector nozzles, twin masterpieces of metallurgy, to the bench. The process of installing them was another ballet of precision. He didn't rush. He torqued each bolt to a specific Newton meter, and his calibrated wrench clicked with satisfying finality. He connected fuel lines, his fingers tracing the paths like a musician familiar with every key on an instrument. The silence in the bay was heavy, punctuated only by the precise sounds of his work and the low hum of the diagnostics computer. The air crackled with suspended disbelief. Finally, he stepped back. Once a symbol of corporate failure, the engine now looked complete. The new components, while subtly different, looked like they belonged, as if the original design had been waiting for them all along. Elijah let out a long, slow breath. He removed his loops, and the world rushed back in. He turned to the small audience. His eyes were tired but clear. "It's ready for a test," he said. His voice was hoarse from hours of silent focus. Before anyone could move, the bay doors slid open. A tall, severe-looking man in an impeccably tailored suit stood there, flanked by two assistants. Robert Vance, chairman of the Dynacorp board. His eyes scanned the scene, taking in the CEO leaning against a tool cabinet, the lead engineers huddled like schoolboys, and the man in coveralls standing before a partially reassembled engine. "Aris," Vance said, his voice a low rumble of dry ice, "we're assembled in the demonstration theater. I assume there's a reason you requested we come down here instead?" "Some dramatic reveal?" His tone made it clear he found drama to be an unprofessional nuisance. Aris straightened up, her CEO persona snapping back into place like a suit of armor. "Robert, the engine had a minor calibration issue. It's being resolved." The lie was smooth but brittle. Vance's eyes flicked to Elijah, then to the engine. "This is the resolution?" "I was under the impression Project Icarus was the pinnacle of our automation and AI-driven design. It appears to require a very human touch." His gaze settled back on Aris, a touch not from our multi-million-dollar R&D team, but from a member of the automotive service staff. The humiliation was public now and far more damaging than any engine failure. It was a direct assault on her core philosophy, that technology, data, and ruthless efficiency could overcome all. Higgins spoke up, his voice firmer than it had been all day. "Mr. Vance, the issue was a fundamental hardware-software integration error. Mr. Jones identified it and has machined a custom solution. We believe it will work." Vance raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Believe is a word that makes investors very nervous, Dr. Higgins." He focused on Elijah. "You machined a solution. Here." "Yes, sir," Elijah said. "And you are confident it will hold at 110% of specified output?" Elijah met the chairman's scrutinizing gaze. The engine will perform as required. Vance was silent for a moment, his eyes calculating. The stakes were too high to walk away. He had to see this through. Very well. Let's not keep the board waiting. You can perform your test in the demonstration theater. In front of everyone. It was not a suggestion. The blood drained from Aris's face. The safety of the bay was gone. This was to be a public execution, and she was to be either the condemner or the condemned, depending on the next few minutes. Under Higgins' frantic direction, a team of technicians carefully moved the engine onto a reinforced trolley. The procession back through the halls of Dynacorp had the solemn, dreadful air of a march to the gallows. Engineers, assistants, and executives peeked out of doorways, drawn by the bizarre spectacle of the board chairman, the CEO, and a mechanic guiding the company's future through the hallway on a trolley. The demonstration theater was a tiered, auditorium-style room with a massive plexiglass window separating the audience from the hazardous test chamber. The 12 members of the board were already seated, their faces a mixture of impatience, curiosity, and deep skepticism. The air was cold. The only sound was the low whisper of the climate control. The engine was carefully mounted back onto the secured test rig in the chamber. Wires and hoses were reconnected. Elijah stood outside the window at the primary control terminal, his hands resting on the console. Aris stood rigidly beside him, with Vance on her other side, watching her like a hawk. "Whenever you are ready, Mr. Jones," Vance said, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. Elijah's fingers danced across the touchscreen, initiating the pre-ignition sequence. The familiar whirring sound filled the chamber, piped into the theater through speakers. Dozens of data streams flashed across the central display screen. Aris held her breath. Her entire career, her life's work, was reduced to this moment. Her fate was in the hands of the man she had mocked, belittled, and tried to use as a scapegoat. The irony was so crushing, she felt physically ill. Elijah's face was impassive, lit by the cool blue glow of the console. He tapped a final command. The ignition sequence fired. For one heart-stopping second, there was silence. Then not a cough, not a bang, but a deep, seamless, powerful whum. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated power. It was smooth. It was quiet. It was perfect. The data on the screen went wild, but not with a warning red. It glowed with triumphant green. RPMs climbed smoothly. Output percentages ticked upward, 100%, 105%, 108%. Elijah's hands moved again, inputting the command to push to 110%. The engine's hum deepened, becoming a resonant, earth-shaking vibration they could feel in their chests. It held, steady, unwavering. The readout flashed, 110%. Spec exceeded, stable. A collective, stunned gasp filled the theater. Higgins let out a choked sob of relief. One of the board members began to clap slowly at first, and then others joined in. It wasn't a celebration, but a spontaneous release of awe and immense relief. Elijah powered down the sequence. The mighty hum faded, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. He turned from the console. He didn't look at the applauding board. He didn't look at the weeping engineers. He looked directly at Aris Thorne. The triumphant applause died down as everyone followed his gaze. The room sensed a different drama was about to unfold. The stage was set. The engine was fixed. The promise had been kept. Now it was time for the collection. The applause sputtered out, strangled by the intensity of Elijah's gaze. He wasn't looking at a CEO, a titan of industry. He was looking at the woman who had tried to break him, and he was waiting. The silence in the demonstration theater became a physical presence, thick and heavy. The only sound was the faint, residual hum of the cooling engine from behind the plexiglass, a testament to his victory. All eyes swiveled to Dr. Aris Thorne. The triumph of the moment, the salvation of her company, turned to ash in her mouth. She stood exposed under the harsh, clinical lights of the theater. The board members, moments before relieved, now watched with the keen interest of spectators at a duel. Robert Vance's expression was unreadable, a mask of corporate inscrutability, but his eyes were fixed on her, waiting for her next move. She had built her empire on unwavering control and perceived infallibility. Now the ground was crumbling beneath her. Every instinct screamed at her to dismiss him, spin this, and use her power to bulldoze through this humiliation. She could fire him on the spot. She could claim credit for his genius, branding it because of her unconventional leadership tactic. But she was trapped. The bet had been public. The insult had been witnessed. The chairman of the board had heard it all. To renege now would not make her look powerful. It would make her look weak, petty, and utterly devoid of honor. Her credibility, the very currency of her power, would be obliterated. Elijah didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His silence was the most powerful demand of all. He stood there, calm, patient, his coveralls a stark contrast to her expensive suit, his quiet dignity a mirror reflecting her hollow arrogance. The pressure was immense. It was the pressure of a lifetime of being twice as good, twice as clever, twice as ruthless as any man in the room, finally turning in on itself. She had used her power as a weapon for so long, she had forgotten it could also be a tool for justice. She took a small, half-step forward. The click of her heel on the tile was deafening in the quiet. Her throat was dry. She looked at Elijah, truly at him, perhaps for the first time. She saw no mechanic, but a man of profound skill and unshakable principle. She saw the intelligence in his eyes, the strength in his posture, the quiet patience that spoke of a confidence that needed no external validation. At that moment, Aris Thorne did something she had not done in a long time. She surrendered. Her shoulders, usually pulled back in defiant authority, slumped almost imperceptibly. The titanium mask of her expression softened into something raw, something human shame. She began, her voice a raspy whisper. She cleared her throat, and when she spoke again, her voice was more unmistakable, carrying through the silent room. The terms of our agreement were unacceptable. She paused, gathering herself. The entire board leaned in, captivated. I used my position and privilege to demean you, Mr. Jones. I attempted to publicly humiliate you to mask my own failure and the failure of my team's approach. It was a gross abuse of power, and it was, beneath this company. Beneath me. The admission seemed to cost her something, but a weight seemed to lift from her as she said it. She turned slightly to include Higgins and his team. I mocked your expertise and your dedication. For that, I am deeply sorry. She turned back to Elijah, her gaze direct now, no longer looking through him, but at him. You demonstrated not only a masterful understanding of engineering principles that eluded my entire department, but you also displayed integrity under pressure that I have clearly lost sight of. She took a deep breath, the final vestiges of her arrogance dissolving. You were right. An apology is what is required. So I offer you my most sincere and humble apology, Elijah. I was wrong. The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer tense. It was stunned, respectful. Resolution. Robert Vance broke the silence. He stepped forward, his sharp eyes moving from the humbled CEO to the triumphant mechanic. An impressive performance, he said, his voice low and measured. On multiple levels. He addressed Elijah directly. Mr. Jones, you have single-handedly salvaged a project that represents the future of this company. You've exposed a critical flaw in our development culture, a over-reliance on theory, and a disconnect from practical application. And you have done so with a level of professionalism that is rare. He turned to Aris. Aris, your actions today were indeed beneath the standards of this office. However, your willingness to acknowledge that fault publicly is a start. The board will be discussing this in depth. Then he turned back to Elijah. Dynacorp does not just reward success, it rewards vision. It rewards the ability to see solutions where others see only problems. Effective immediately, the position of head of propulsion systems integration is vacant. The role oversees the handoff from R&D to practical application across all divisions. It requires a unique mind, a mind that understands both the code and the metal. He paused, letting the offer hang in the air. The salary and equity package will be commensurate with the senior vice president level. You will report directly to the CTO and to me. It was more than a promotion. It was a transformation. It was a leap from the service bay to the highest echelons of corporate power. It was poetic justice delivered not with a shout, but with the calm authority of a chairman who recognized invaluable talent. Elijah looked from Vance to Aris, who could only nod, a complex mix of shame and dawning respect on her face. He then looked around the room, at the board members who were now looking at him not with curiosity but with newfound regard. He thought of his mother, who had sacrificed everything for his education. He thought of his grandfather's hands, stained with grease and pride. This was their victory, too. "Thank you, Mr. Vance," Elijah said, his voice steady. "I accept." "On one condition." Vance raised an eyebrow. "A condition? I choose my team, and my first hire is Dr. Higgins and his engineers. They weren't incompetent. They were misdirected. They have the theoretical knowledge. I have the practical. Together, we won't just fix problems. We'll prevent them." It was a move of breathtaking grace and intelligence. He wasn't just seizing power. He was building a bridge. He was healing the rift she had created. Vance allowed a small, genuine smile to touch his lips. A wise first decision. Approved. The board meeting dissolved. The members filed out, shaking Elijah's hand, offering quiet congratulations. The theater emptied until it was just Elijah, Aris, and the silent engine. Aris stood alone, looking smaller than she had just an hour before. The victory was hers, yet it felt entirely like his. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly, referring to his hiring of her team. "Yes, I did," Elijah replied. "This company doesn't need more division. It needs synthesis. It needs to remember that innovation isn't just born in a lab. It's born in the friction between an idea and the real world." He picked up his trusted, worn toolbox. "I'll expect the briefing materials on my new desk first thing tomorrow morning, Dr. Thorne." He didn't wait for a response. He walked out of the demonstration theater, not with a swagger, but with the same quiet, purposeful stride he had entered with hours before. He left behind a fixed engine, a humbled CEO, and a transformed future. The underdog hadn't just won, he had changed the game. He had taken the cruel joke of a marriage proposal and turned it into a different kind, a proposal for respect, integrity, and a better way to build the future. And in doing so, he hadn't just fixed an engine. He had rebuilt an entire corporate culture, one precise, perfectly torqued bolt at a time. This story is about the power of keeping your cool when everyone else is losing theirs. It's about the strength found in dignity and the undeniable force of raw skill. If you believe that talent can be found anywhere and that respect is earned, not given by a title, hit that subscribe button. Because here we celebrate the underdogs, the quiet experts, and the moments when justice is served not by a gavel, but by a perfectly calibrated wrench. Share this story with someone who must remember that character is your greatest currency. Thanks for watching.